Dr. Woldemuth, thank you for being here with us today. I truly appreciate your willingness to share with us some of your views about mixed methods, qualitative and quantitative methods of inquiry. And on that note, what's your opinion, what's your idea about mixed methods? What do you think about it?
For me, mixed methods is a research endeavor in and of its own right. So it's something separate from quantitative research. It's something separate from qualitative research. It's its own thing. And when I say it's its own thing, I mean epistemologically and ontologically and paradigmatically, right? It has its own set of traditions, it has its own set of methods, and it has its own set of standards and quality criteria by which it's conducted. And so while certainly mixed methods borrows from other research traditions in order to construct how it understands itself, I still view it as a research endeavor in and of its own right.
What are key concepts in mixed method?
Of mixed method research. So I tend to start philosophically when I start talking about research. And so for me, the key components of mixed methods research are usually beginning with some sort of a pragmatic orientation towards research, although mixed methodologists have argued for more of a neo-positivist orientation or also for a critical realist orientation. But most often, mixed methodologists talk about answering questions from a pragmatic orientation. And so that means they're interested in questions that are not necessarily, that are more oriented toward the outcome. So the goodness of the research or the quality of the research is in the outcomes, can be judged by the outcomes that it produces, which is a bit of an oversimplification of the philosophy of pragmatism. But in general, that's the way I see mixed methods research conducted.
If you were to draw a comparison between mixed methods, qualitative and quantitative methods, what would be the main differences?
Well, again, that would be philosophically different in some ways. So quantitative research tends to be positivist or I don't really think there are many positivists left in the world, so neo-positivists or post-positivists. Most of the quantitative research tends to be conducted under that sort of philosophical umbrella, and all the tenets that go along with that. Qualitative research can run the gamut. I mean, you can have post-positivist oriented qualitative research, although most qualitative research for me tends to start from more of a constructivist paradigm and moving, as much as problematic as Continuum are, moving all the way to sort of post-structural orientations or postmodern orientations to research. And mixed methods situates itself within a tradition of pragmatism, although pragmatism is also taken up by narrative inquirers to talk about the work they do. So certainly research paradigm does not dictate method, but at least when I think about differences between mixed methods and quantitative research, I tend to think that quantitative researchers are interested in things like causality, they're interested in prediction, and mixed methodologists in the quantitative arm may be interested in those things, but in a qualitative arm they're going to be opening up space to ask other kinds of questions that would not be oriented toward causality.
Is there an example of mixed method that you can share with us?
The main work that I've conducted to date in qualitative research is a narrative inquiry. And the narrative inquiry was a study of the performance and production of masculinity in higher education. So I interviewed 5 male graduate students from various academic disciplines, and I asked them questions like, what does it mean to you to be a man? How do you know you're a man? What does it mean to you to be a heterosexual? How do you know you're a heterosexual? With the caveat that all these men were selected because they identified as men and as heterosexuals. And then I asked them how that plays out in their graduate program. And my main interest was to understand how academic discourses, the language and the thought processes that we pick up as we're being trained to become academics in various disciplines, how those are taken up when we talk about other things. And in my case, those other things were, how are those discourses taken up to talk about gender and to talk about the gender order, the nature of the gender order. So I conducted 7 interviews with each of these male participants, so a total of 35 interviews. And then wrote up the results, right?
Now, you, as a student trying to understand these different research methods, I may have the question of, but you were the researcher and also the person who actually conducted the interviews, and I'm assuming the person who did the analysis afterward. So, from that perspective, okay, how do you manage or quote unquote figure out the role of the interviewer herself in this process of inquiry?
So I should also say that the inquiry method or the interview method that I used is something that I called an inquiry of discomfort. So the aim of an inquiry discomfort is to not only is to conduct an interview in alignment with the philosophical orientation of the research. And so if the aim of my research is to unsettle gender in higher education, then I also wanted my interview to unsettle gender in the interview relationship. And so at the same time, I'm questioning my gender identity and saying, well, what does it mean to be a woman talking to you? I'm asking the participant, what does it mean to you to be a man talking to me? And the interview method was around challenging contradictions when they came up. So a participant might have constructed a certain characterization of masculinity in one interview, and then at the next interview said something that was contradictory to that or is different from that. And I would point that out in the interview method. So it's almost employing strategies of narrative therapy within a narrative interview context to challenge our fixity or our desire to be identified as certain subjects, and in this case as men and women as gendered subjects. So to say all that, I mean, your question is apt, and not only is it, but it's not just apt because in general that's something qualitative researchers think about, but also because of the particular method. So I involve myself deeply in the method and almost could be accused of mobilizing my power as an interviewer to change participants in a way that I thought they ought to change, right? So it's complex. In qualitative research, the relationship between the researcher and the research findings is one-to-one, it's inextricable. And so the onus is on the qualitative researcher to be reflexive, to be transparent, to talk about what it is that they're bringing to the research study. Because there's no black box in which you put your data in and you sit, although I should say there are qualitative analysis software now that will actually do word count sorts of things for you and map out, your different key terms and the relationships to them. But most qualitative research doesn't attempt that sort of objectivity in data analysis. So the researcher is the data analysis tool. And the theories that you bring to that research project are part and parcel of the research. And qualitative researchers, when they take that perspective, and I shouldn't say qualitative researchers, but researchers with that sort of constructivist orientation to research or postmodern orientation to research, will turn that lens on quantitative research and say, and actually what you're doing is really no different. What you're doing is also value-laden. You're just not naming your values. You're not naming that your research history comes from a colonialist or oppressive Western orientation to generating knowledge, for example.
Now, many times my students will argue that qualitative studies are important because they help us learn a different perspective of people's experience, and then they allow us to generalize to the general population from those individual experiences or small group experiences or small sample experiences. What do you think about the idea of generalizability in qualitative research?
So the question becomes, to whom are we attempting to generalize, or to what situations are we attempting to generalize? And most of the conversations that I have around qualitative research are not about generalizing to populations or generalizing to settings. They're around generalizing to theory. So we use theory to interpret our findings, and hopefully we come up with theoretical findings, right? Findings that inform theory. And so the idea is that you're not generalizing to people, you're generalizing to findings. And then there's also the issue around that generalizability isn't a criteria by which we even talk about whether or not qualitative research, generalizing to populations isn't a quality criteria for qualitative research. It's around resonance, and it's around transferability. And so the researcher develops thick, rich descriptions and uses audit trails, for example, and explains quite clearly what they bring to the research and how the research was conducted, so that the reader gets a sense of, yes, I understand how this happened, I can see how the researcher came to those conclusions, and those conclusions make sense to me, they resonate with me. If you're doing more critical theory sort of work, you would ask, how much does this research challenge me? How much does it challenge me to think differently? How much does it challenge society to think differently? So that's another sort of quality criteria that wouldn't be related to generalizability at all.
Would you like to add something else?
I think the big thing for me when I'm working on my own work and when I'm working with students is that I graduated in 2007, so I'm not that far out of my PhD program. And I know that when I first came into my PhD program, I was expected to choose a camp, right? I was expected to say, I'm quantitative or I'm qualitative, right? And as I took way too long to finish my PhD, I began to see that expectation start to shift. And it shifted not just in my own program, but it shifted in the literature I was reading. And mixed methods was sort of starting to emerge and was experiencing a bit of a heyday. So a lot of the conversations around coming to understand oneself as a researcher became more about your philosophical orientation to research. And then the question became, is your philosophical orientation to research an identity? And the thing that I try to say to students is that it's not an identity. It's something that can be taken up. So just as I seek to loosen people's fixities and loosen my own fixity on my desire to be seen as a woman or whatever, I also desire to loosen my own fixity on being seen as a qualitative researcher, whatever that means, or being seen as a quantitative researcher. And I'm not sure where that puts us now, except I think for students who are thinking about methods, I think the landscape is far more complicated, perhaps, than it was 10, 15 years ago when you had a binary and you just chose one or the other. And now students are expected to be able to engage research from multiple paradigms and from multiple methods, and to do it with theoretical sophistication and methodological savvy. And so I understand the challenge that students
Yeah,
are
well,
facing.
actually, it's interesting you mentioned that because, for example, one of my colleagues once said to me, I understand that we have a qualitative method of inquiry and a quantitative method of inquiry, but I can't see how you can mix them.
Mm.
And so the idea of a mixed method is almost like either a utopia or an impossibility, and therefore they actually do not believe in
And
the
that's-
possibility of mixed method. What's your opinion about that?
And that's why I orient it as something in and of its own right. I think it is possible. It's done. It's something that's done, but it isn't done necessarily as a post-positivist, or it isn't done as a constructivist. It's done as a pragmatist, or it's done as a critical realist. And when it's done within those philosophical traditions, then it makes sense. Then it's internally consistent, if you will, if that's a criteria that you want to use to establish its legitimacy.
Now, on that note, one of the comments that I've heard was, show me a mixed method research. Give me an example.
Mm-hmm.
Can you think of one?
Mm, sure. I can think of one that's I can think of one that's both. It's sort of a both and. When I was down in Australia, I headed up what you might call the quantitative arm of a mixed methods evaluation of an early literacy program. And this early literacy program was an intervention, and it was meant to improve the early literacy skills of Indigenous students in the Northern Territory of Australia. So the quantitative arm was, in the final year of the study, was a randomized controlled trial, multi-site randomized controlled trial. And that was meant to answer specific research questions around the effectiveness of this intervention. The qualitative arm to this study was meant to answer the question, if we give this intervention to teachers out in remote Indigenous communities, because that's the population we were trying to meet, and provide them with the kind of support that's typical of that region for teachers who are learning new interventions and using new things in their classrooms, what's going to happen? So that was a multiple site case study. So we used both of those to talk about the impact of this intervention, and then what would happen if this intervention was just done naturalistically, quote unquote. And both of those worked together to inform our recommendations to the government, really, around whether or not this intervention should be scaled up, quote unquote. But what's interesting about that qualitative arm of that study is that for me, the analysis for to answer those questions around, well, what happened, was kind of more of a simplistic, superficial level thematic analysis. We talked to teachers, we went to schools, we interviewed, and we used those and we observed the classrooms, and we used that to inform questions around practice and policy, right? But some of the more theoretically rich questions that I think qualitative research can get us to were around teacher discourse in the classrooms, and how it is that teachers were using language to position some groups of students, Indigenous students in particular, as unteachable. And they were drawing on discourse from disability studies. So these students hadn't been actually diagnosed with any disabilities. They don't have the resources to send someone out to actually diagnose students in the majority of these communities. And so the teachers would say, oh, well, that student has ADHD, or oh, that student's EBD, or that one's clearly autistic. And that was code for this student is unteachable. And so that to me was a far richer and more interesting qualitative research study that wasn't necessarily related to our original questions around what happens with this intervention. Although I reckon if we went back to it, we may be able to draw some of that and make some of those linkages and perhaps bring that in. But I appreciated that study as a discrete qualitative study in and of itself. And I think that that's, for me, where that study becomes less about mixed methods. Yvonne S. Lincoln and Bruce Thompson, where this question was put to them, and their description of what mixed methods ought to be was that you ought to have a collection, a group of researchers who you have some quantitative experts who can run the quantitative study, and you have qualitative experts who can run the qualitative study, and then the combining of results comes at the end. After all the analyses have been done, it comes in the conversations that happen at the end. So both of them, when they were interviewed, said they would never advise a PhD student to do a mixed methods dissertation because of the expertise that's required. I don't see that in the literature that I've been reading from Tasha Corey and Tedley and from Anwe Busey and Leach and so on and so forth. I don't see them making those same kinds of claims.